So I've been watching every episode of Monday Night Raw from 2008 in an effort to relive my childhood a little bit. Monday Night Raw in 2008 is where my journey as a wrestling fan officially started. I started watching WWE consistently during that time, and as a kid, I'm grateful for that time period. Even if rewatching all of that stuff now, I've come to realize it wasn't all that great. As a kid, the majority of the storylines had a lot more weight to them. It's like going back and playing old video games that you could beat as a kid and fucking eating that game alive now because you're old enough to know how to play. Looking at you, Sly Cooper. Now, maybe my revisionist history is overtaking reality just a little bit, but I'll go as far as to consider this episode of Monday Night Raw being the first episode that I tuned in for, even if I wasn't allowed to stay up past the 10 o'clock hour, because staying up to 11 was just an hour too late, according to my mom at the time. Thankfully, I was eventually granted permission to stay up until the show was over, and thus all my earliest memories of watching wrestling live on television officially began. I've always considered my first match, or at least the first match that sucked me into the world of pro wrestling, the Intercontinental Championship match between Jeff Hardy and Chris Jericho on the show. Looking back on the entire event now, it was the best on the entire show, although that isn't exactly saying much, but even more than that, it holds a lot more sentimental value for me. I believe this was my first time seeing Jeff Hardy, and immediately upon seeing this dude, from his look to his entrance and eventually to the way that he wrestled, the guy captured my imagination of a pro wrestler as a kid. I wanted to be as cool as I thought he was. Jericho, on the other hand, I thought was cool in the way that your older brother probably would think that he's cool. Not that I have one. You could tell even just by listening to the crowd that the women and children were batshit for Jeff, and the men in the crowd were the ones cheering on Jericho. It was an interesting dynamic to pick up on now after all these years, and had a far more organic feel to it than, say, any John Cena match, where the company would incessantly push that the reactions that he was getting was a good thing, despite millions of fans that he and the company eventually drove away. At least during this time period, he was yet to be as insufferable as he eventually became, or at the very least, that's just how I remember it. Another positive that I was able to draw from this show was the match between Edge and CM Punk. The spear that Edge hit on Punk to finish the match was by far one of the most creative that I can remember seeing in a long time, especially considering how Roman Reigns and WWE butchered the hell out of that finish with how predictable it always was, and on top of that being his deadliest move of doom during his reign of terror as a babyface. Outside of that, good fucking grief was this show long. The one positive thing that I could say about Monday Night Raw back in 2008 above anything else for the most part is that it ran pretty quick for 2 hours. The majority of the show were the usual entertainment over wrestling, and a lot of the segments featuring their bigger names actually helped pass the time immensely. Even if not every segment was a hit, at least a lot of them were. On this episode, though, for a 3 hour special, even without the commercials, boy did it ever feel like it was 3 hours. And it's kind of funny. As a kid, whenever WWE would announce a special 3 hour episode of Monday Night Raw a week in advance, I'd spend that entire week leading up to the show looking forward to it like mad. But then again, I guess you could say that WWE was my escape, and hearing that I'd be getting an extra hour and my 2 hour long escape from the world was music to my fucking ears. Like I said, I'm a lot older now, life's a lot harder than it was for me at 10 years old, and Raw is a lot worse off at 3 hours every week than it probably ever has been, so my perspective on that has changed quite a lot since then. And as for this show, outside of the two matches that I mentioned earlier, it was pretty much garbage for the most part. The Undertaker versus Mark Henry in a casket match was a complete novelty and a waste of time, even though 10-year-old me found The Undertaker compelling enough to justify the match being any good. 22-year-old me doesn't buy into The Undertaker in the same way, unfortunately. Although it was nice to see him wrestle again from back when he was really in his prime. Mr. Kennedy versus Finlay was a complete show killer, as was the entire Vince McMahon's bastard son storyline that desperately needed to be attached to someone like CM Punk or Mr. Kennedy instead of Hornswoggle. And by the way, for as many good things that people like to say about Finlay and how he was the real deal back in Japan, if you grew up watching the guy in WWE, you could never tell. Him and his fucking shillelagh had Big Show heat with me. Whenever he was on, you were just like, oh fuck, it's this guy again. And Seth or his horseshit waiting for the show to pick up again. This motherfucker was the Johnny Test of Saturday morning cartoons. He was the shitty cartoon that you'd sit through to get to the good shit. And I wouldn't even bother getting into Hornswoggle in this review. Triple H versus Kane was disappointing, I guess, but then again, I'm not sure what else to expect from from that match in the first place. Melina versus Maria drove this show further into the ground, and for as much as I hate to say it, Maria just posed for Playboy. Why the fuck weren't they leaning into it more? The last time that Melina and Maria had a match on Raw in 2008 prior to this show, Melina pulled Maria's pants down in the finish of the match, and Maria went along with it without a care in the world until Santino covered her up with his jacket. If you're going to go diva with your women's division and have that storyline with Maria posing for Playboy, then find creative ways to go full diva. Lean into the creative side of driving up the sex appeal on the show, because even for as much as I'm not a fan of that shit, at least it had a purpose with Maria on this show, and she managed to pull it off better than most wrestlers could in WWE, and made it more than just eye candy on WWE TV. Why have her go out there after just having posed for Playboy in a standard wrestling match when her biggest draw, I should say, was her sex appeal? The company themselves set the standard here, not me. If they had gone full Playboy diva with Maria in a creative sense like they were with that match between her and Melina earlier this year, then not only would have the match been better off, but so would have the entire show. Instead, it was a complete dud on this show. After that, we had a weigh-in segment between Mayweather and The Big Show, and honestly, the less said about whatever that was supposed to be, the better. The main event of the show between John Cena and Shawn Michaels sucked, and I'm sorry, but I never liked any of the matches that these two had together. Not their WrestleMania match, not their Broadway match on Raw, and especially not a match between the two main eventing on an already dead show like this one. The show was long. It was about as bad of a show as I've come to expect Monday Night Raw to be these days.